You don't belong in first class." The sentence didn't just land. It sliced through the quiet cabin like a blade, sharp enough to turn heads, and still the soft hum of pre-flight chatter at gate B14. Nicole Harris stood there, posture stiff, smile thin, holding half of a boarding pass that no longer existed, while Marcus Carter remained seated in 2A, calm, composed, dressed in nothing more than a fitted black t-shirt, dark jeans, and worn sneakers that didn't match the polished image expected in a $8,000 first-class seat. Around him, eyes shifted, some curious, some judgmental, others already reaching for their phones, sensing something unfolding. Nicole didn't hesitate as she handed the seat over to a well-dressed white couple behind her, their champagne glasses catching the overhead light like approval, as if this quiet reassignment made perfect sense. Marcus didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't even reach for the torn paper at his feet. Instead, he leaned back slowly, the leather seat creaking under the weight of a man who had seen this moment before. Not here, not this exact place, but the same look, the same assumption, the same quiet dismissal dressed up as policy. 20 years earlier, it had been a hiring manager who told him he wasn't the image they were looking for. And now here it was again, just in a different uniform, a different stage, same script. Nicole crossed her arms, her voice colder now, louder for the audience forming around them. "Sir, you can either move to economy or you can exit the aircraft." And still, Marcus didn't move. The tension in the cabin tightened, like something invisible pulling at every seatbelt before takeoff, a pressure building without a sound. A trainee flight attendant a few rows back shifted uncomfortably, whispering to herself that she had seen his ticket scan green, but her voice never made it past her lips. A man across the aisle shook his head, muttering under his breath, while a woman near the window lifted her phone just high enough to capture everything without being noticed. Marcus reached into his pocket, not for a wallet, not for proof, but for his phone, his expression unchanged, his breathing steady, his presence anchored as if the chaos around him didn't apply. He tapped the screen once, paused, then typed 3 words with deliberate precision. Initiate tier read. He didn't look up when he sent it, didn't need to, because in his world, power didn't announce itself. It executed. Nicole scoffed softly, turning away as if the situation was already resolved, as if the man in 2A had been erased the moment she decided he didn't belong. But Marcus remained, still seated, still silent, eyes forward, as the first flicker of something unseen began to ripple far beyond the cabin walls, something bigger than a seat, bigger than a flight, something already in motion, waiting for the exact moment to be felt. The cabin did not return to normal after that moment because something in the air had shifted, something subtle but undeniable, like the pressure drop before a storm you cannot yet see. And while Nicole moved on with her duties, offering rehearsed smiles to other passengers and pretending the situation in row 2 had been resolved, Marcus Carter remained exactly where he was, still seated, still silent. His posture relaxed in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if he was not waiting for permission but for timing. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a navy blazer leaned toward his wife and whispered that this did not feel right, that the man had not raised his voice once. While 2 rows behind them, a young woman adjusted her phone just enough to keep recording, her screen capturing every glance, every shift in tone, every small detail that others might miss. The couple now sitting in 2A laughed quietly, clinking their glasses as if nothing unusual had happened. But even their voices carried a trace of uncertainty, because deep down they could feel it too, that something about this exchange did not sit clean. Near the galley, a trainee flight attendant named Emily Ross stood frozen for a second longer than she should have, her training telling her to follow protocol, but her instincts telling her something else entirely. Because she remembered the scan, she remembered the green light. She remembered the name on the screen before it disappeared, and that memory sat heavy in her chest like a truth she could not unsee. Nicole passed by again, her voice low but firm as she spoke into her handheld device, mentioning a passenger refusal, framing the narrative in a way that placed control back in her hands. But her fingers moved a little faster than usual, tapping the screen with a hint of tension that had not been there before. Marcus did not look at her, did not acknowledge the movement around him, his focus fixed somewhere ahead, calm in a way that did not match the growing unease of the cabin. And when his phone vibrated once in his hand, he glanced down briefly, just long enough to read the single-line response. Tier Red acknowledged. From that moment on, the changes were not immediate, not obvious, but they began, quietly, beneath the surface of everything, the kind of shift that does not announce itself until it is too late to reverse. In the cockpit, a notification blinked once on a secondary display, subtle enough to be ignored at first glance, while at the gate, a ground operations supervisor frowned at his tablet as a routine status update lagged for half a second longer than expected. Back in the cabin, Emily took one cautious step forward, her voice barely above a whisper as she leaned toward Nicole and said that she had seen the ticket scan valid, that there might have been a mistake, but Nicole did not even turn fully toward her, dismissing it with a quick shake of her head and a reminder about staying in position during escalation. The words hung there, heavier than they should have, because they were not just instructions, they were a decision, and everyone within earshot felt it. Marcus finally shifted slightly in his seat, not to leave, not to comply, but to settle in more comfortably, as if preparing for a delay he already knew was coming. And somewhere far beyond the aircraft, systems that had always run without question began to hesitate, just for a fraction of a second, as if waiting for the next command. The delay no one could explain arrived like a quiet glitch in reality, small enough to dismiss at first, but strange enough to linger in the back of every trained mind, because planes do not hesitate, and systems do not second-guess. Yet the overhead display flickered once, just a blink, just long enough for the captain in the cockpit to glance down and frown at a notification that did not match any standard protocol. Back in the cabin, Nicole continued her routine with tighter movements, her confidence still present, but now layered with something else, something less certain. As she checked her tablet and noticed a loading icon that spun longer than it should have, her finger tapping the screen again as if pressure alone could force it to respond. Emily stood frozen near the galley, her eyes drifting between Marcus and the device in Nicole's hand, the silence growing heavier with every passing second, because now it was no longer just about a seat. It was about something not working the way it always had. Marcus Carter remained still, his gaze steady, his breathing slow, as if the unfolding disruption was not a surprise, but a confirmation. And when another soft vibration touched his phone, he did not rush to check it. He simply waited a beat, then looked down with the same calm precision he had shown from the beginning. The message was short, almost clinical, Tier Red expanding, and he nodded once, barely noticeable, as if acknowledging a step in a process already set in motion. Across the aisle, the man in the navy blazer leaned forward again, this time not whispering but speaking low enough to carry to those nearby, saying something about the system acting strange, about how flights do not just pause like that. And his wife glanced toward Marcus with a different kind of curiosity now, not judgment, not dismissal, but recognition that something deeper was at play. The couple in 2A shifted in their seats, their earlier ease beginning to crack as the woman tried to refresh the in-flight menu on her screen only to find it unresponsive, her smile fading slightly as she looked toward Nicole for reassurance that did not come as quickly as before. In the cockpit, the captain's voice lowered as he contacted ground control, asking for confirmation on a status update that should have been routine, but the reply came back delayed, fragmented, and just uncertain enough to raise concern. On the ground, a supervisor at the gate tapped his headset twice, asking why multiple outbound flights were showing pending clearance at the same time, a scenario that did not align with any scheduled sequence, and for the first time, the word delay began to circulate in tones that carried more weight than usual. Inside the cabin, Nicole finally turned fully toward Marcus, her expression sharper now, her authority pushing forward again as she stepped closer and said, with less patience and more edge, that he needed to comply before this situation escalated further. But Marcus did not look up immediately. He finished reading the message on his phone, locked the screen, then slowly lifted his eyes to meet hers. And in that moment, something shifted again, not in volume, not in motion, but in control, because the room that had once moved around her command now felt like it was waiting on his. Emily took a breath she did not realize she was holding. The passengers leaned in without meaning to, and Marcus spoke for the first time since the silence began. His voice calm, measured, almost quiet, but carrying through the cabin with a clarity that cut deeper than any raised tone. You might want to check your system again. And somewhere far beyond the aircraft, across terminals and control rooms and silent data centers, the pause turned into something else entirely, something larger, something no one in that cabin had expected to be connected to one man sitting calmly in seat 2A. Emily could not hold it in anymore because the silence had gone too far, too heavy, too wrong to ignore, and this time her voice did not stay small as she stepped forward into the narrow aisle, her hands slightly trembling but her words clear enough to cut through the tension. I scanned his ticket myself. It was valid. And for a brief moment the entire cabin shifted again, every eye turning not just toward Marcus, but toward her, toward the one person willing to say what everyone else had started to suspect. Nicole turned sharply, her expression tightening as she looked at Emily with a warning that did not need to be spoken, but the damage was already done, because once truth enters a room like this, it does not leave quietly. A man near the window nodded slowly, saying under his breath that he had seen the same thing, that the passenger had not caused any disruption, and now the murmurs were no longer whispers. They were forming a current, low but steady, moving through the rows. Nicole tried to regain control, her tone rising just enough to reassert authority as she said that procedures were being followed and that the situation was under review, but her words no longer landed the same way, not with the system behind her beginning to hesitate, not with the doubt now visible in the faces around her. Marcus remained seated, still composed, watching the moment unfold without stepping into it, as if he understood that the shift happening in the room was just as important as the one happening beyond it. In the cockpit, the captain received another alert, this one more direct, more urgent, indicating a network-wide delay affecting multiple outbound flights, and his hand paused over the controls for a second longer than training allowed, because this was no longer a minor issue. This was something spreading. On the ground, supervisors were now speaking over each other, trying to understand why clearance signals were stacking, why departures were freezing in sequence, why systems that had always responded instantly were now lagging by seconds that felt like minutes. Back in the cabin, Nicole glanced down at her tablet again, refreshing, tapping, trying to force a response. But the screen only returned partial data, fragmented information that did not make sense, and for the first time, her confidence cracked just enough to be seen. Emily took another step forward, her voice steadier now, no longer just a trainee following rules, but someone standing in them. There was no reason to remove him, she said, and the words landed harder than she expected, because they were not just a statement, they were a line drawn in the middle of everything. The couple in 2A shifted again, exchanging looks that no longer carried comfort, the man adjusting his jacket as if suddenly aware that the seat he occupied was not as secure as it had seemed. Minutes ago, Marcus finally leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, his presence changing just enough to signal that the moment was approaching, and when his phone vibrated again, this time he checked it immediately, his eyes scanning the message with a calm that did not match the growing unease around him. He looked up, not at Nicole, not at Emily, but at the cabin as a whole, at the people who had watched, who had questioned, who had begun to understand, and in that quiet space between one breath and the next, the truth was no longer something hidden, it was something waiting to be spoken, and every system, every screen, every person seemed to be holding in that same suspended second, just before everything changed. The moment stretched thinner than it should have, like time itself was hesitating, and then Nicole made the mistake that changed everything, because instead of stepping back, instead of reassessing, she stepped forward again, closing the distance with a sharp edge in her voice as she reached toward Marcus's shoulder, not forceful but firm enough to signal control, to signal removal, to signal that in her mind the decision had already been made. And in that instant, something deeper shifted, not just in the cabin, but inside Marcus himself, because that line, that subtle crossing from dismissal into physical assertion, echoed something older, something buried but never forgotten. For a split second, his mind moved somewhere else, not the polished cabin of a first-class flight, but a cramped office 20 years earlier, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as a hiring manager leaned back and said he did not look like someone who belonged in leadership, that clients would not respond well. That image mattered more than credentials, and he remembered sitting there, younger, quieter, swallowing the moment because he had no power to challenge it then. But this was not that moment anymore, and he was not that man anymore. Marcus gently leaned back just enough to remove the contact without creating a scene, his movement controlled, deliberate, his eyes lifting to meet Nicole's not with anger, not with frustration, but with something far more unsettling, certainty. The cabin felt it immediately, the tension no longer just uncomfortable but charged, like the air before lightning. Emily took a half step forward instinctively, her voice catching in her throat as she watched the interaction unfold, knowing without fully understanding that something irreversible had just happened. Across the aisle, the man in the navy blazer straightened in his seat, his earlier curiosity now replaced with a quiet alertness, as if he was witnessing the exact second a situation tipped from misunderstanding into consequence. Nicole withdrew her hand, but did not step back, doubling down instead, her tone sharper now as she said that failure to comply would result in further action, her words sounding rehearsed but now lacking the authority they once carried. Marcus did not respond immediately. He simply reached for his phone again, unlocking it with a calm precision that felt almost ceremonial, and when he spoke, his voice was low, measured, but carried through the cabin with undeniable clarity. "You have already taken it further than you should have." And then he tapped the screen once more. This time the response came faster, almost instant, and his eyes scanned the message briefly before locking the phone again. In the cockpit, alarms did not sound, but alerts multiplied, cascading across displays as systems began to flag inconsistencies that should not exist. And on the ground, a supervisor's voice rose over the radio asking why multiple aircraft were now holding position without clearance updates, why departures were stacking beyond acceptable thresholds. Back in the cabin, the couple in 2A shifted again, the man placing his glass down carefully as if sudden movement might break something fragile in the moment, while the woman glanced toward Marcus with a look that was no longer dismissive but uncertain, almost uneasy. Emily finally found her voice, stronger this time, stepping closer as she said clearly that there was no justification for removal, that the ticket had been valid, that this had gone too far, and the words hung in the air like a line no one could pretend had not been drawn. Marcus leaned back into his seat once more, his posture relaxed again, but the calm had changed. It was no longer passive, it was active, controlled, intentional, as if he had allowed the moment to reach this exact point before responding. And as the seconds passed, the quiet disruptions beneath the surface began to rise, no longer invisible, no longer ignorable, and every person in that cabin could feel it, even if they could not yet name it. That the cost of what had just happened was no longer theoretical, it was already being calculated somewhere far beyond their view. The shift was no longer subtle, no longer something you could dismiss as a delay or a technical hiccup, because now it was everywhere, bleeding into every system that kept the airline moving. And inside the cockpit, the captain's voice dropped into a tone reserved for situations that did not have clear answers as he read off a message that had just appeared across his primary display. A message that did not come from standard operations, but from a higher authority channel, flagged in a way he had only seen once before during a full system audit. On the ground, multiple supervisors were now standing, no longer seated at their stations, their eyes locked on screens that showed flight after flight entering a hold status simultaneously, a cascade that did not follow any weather pattern, any maintenance issue, any known cause, and one of them said out loud what no one else wanted to say yet. "This looks like a system override." Back in the cabin, Nicole's tablet went completely blank for a second before rebooting, the airline logo flashing across the screen like a reset, and when it returned, her access panel was gone, replaced with a restricted notice that made no sense to her, because she had never seen it before, not in training, not in practice, not ever. Her composure cracked just enough for it to show as she tapped the screen again, harder this time, as if force could restore control, but nothing changed. Emily noticed it immediately, her eyes widening slightly as she took in the shift, because this was no longer about a disagreement. This was something operational, something serious, something bigger than anyone. Passenger. Marcus Carter remained exactly as he had been, seated, calm, his presence now carrying a different weight, not passive, not reactive, but centered, as if everything unfolding was aligning with a timeline only he could see. When his phone vibrated again, he did not rush, he did not react outwardly. He simply checked the message with a quiet glance, and for the first time, a faint shift crossed his expression. Not a smile, not satisfaction, but confirmation. The message read, Tier Red. Active across network, executive lock confirmed. Across the aisle, the man in the navy blazer exhaled slowly, shaking his head as he looked toward Marcus, not with doubt anymore, but with realization, because this was no longer coincidence. This was cause and effect playing out in real time. The couple in 2A now sat completely still, their earlier confidence replaced with a silence that mirrored the rest of the cabin. The woman's hand resting lightly on the armrest, as if unsure where to place it, her eyes flicking between Marcus and Nicole, searching for an explanation that was not coming. Nicole finally looked up from her tablet, her voice lower now, less certain, as she tried to re-establish control by speaking into her device again, requesting assistance, referencing a system issue. But even her words lacked the sharpness they once carried, because the authority she had relied on was no longer responding. Emily stepped closer to her, her voice quiet but steady, saying that something was wrong with the system, that this was not normal, and for the first time, Nicole did not dismiss her, did not interrupt, because she could see it too now. Marcus slowly stood from his seat, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a calm precision that drew every eye in the cabin toward him, and when he straightened, the space seemed to shift with him, as if the center of gravity in the room had moved. He did not raise his voice, did not step forward aggressively. He simply looked at Nicole, then briefly at the passengers who had watched everything unfold, and said in a tone that was steady, controlled, and impossible to ignore, "What you are seeing is not a delay." And the words hung there, heavier than anything that had come before, because for the first time, everyone understood that whatever had just been set in motion was not temporary, not accidental, and definitely not small. The cabin did not breathe. It held itself still as Marcus's words settled into the space between them, heavy and deliberate. And for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, because something in his tone had shifted the rules of the room. Nicole stared at him, her authority now hanging by a thread she could not see but could feel slipping, her voice trying to recover its edge as she said this was still her aircraft, still her responsibility, still her decision, but the words lacked the force they once carried, because behind her, the system that supported every command she made was no longer responding. Marcus took one slow step forward into the aisle, not invading space but claiming presence, his posture straight, his gaze steady, and when he spoke again, his voice did not rise, it narrowed, focused, cutting through every layer of confusion with a clarity that could not be ignored. "You did not just deny me a seat," he said, pausing just long enough for the weight of that sentence to land, for every person in the cabin to lean into what came next. "You triggered a system-level response you were never meant to touch." The words did not sound like a threat, they sounded like a fact, and that was what made them dangerous. Nicole's expression faltered, her eyes flicking down to her tablet again as if it might suddenly correct itself, but the restricted notice remained, unchanging, unyielding. In the cockpit, the captain received another message, this one direct, unmistakable, flagged with executive authority clearance, instructing immediate hold across connected departures, and his hand hovered above the console as he read it twice, then a third time, because it did not align with anything he had ever seen initiated from within a single flight. On the ground, the control room was no longer quiet, voices overlapping, questions rising. The word override now spoken openly as supervisors tried to trace the origin of the command, only to find it linked not to weather, not to maintenance, but to an executive protocol rarely activated and never lightly triggered. Back in the cabin, Emily's breath caught as she looked at Marcus, the pieces beginning to connect in a way that felt almost unreal, her voice barely above a whisper as she said his name, not loudly, not to challenge, but in recognition. Marcus Carter, and the name moved through the cabin like a ripple, soft at first, then stronger as others heard it, processed it, reacted to it. Nicole's eyes snapped back. To him, the disbelief clear now, not hidden, not controlled, because she knew that name. She had seen it in training modules, in internal briefings, in the quiet mentions of ownership and oversight that existed far above her level. Marcus did not confirm it immediately. He did not rush to declare anything. He simply looked at her, then at the cabin, and then he said it, calm, measured, final. I am Marcus Carter. Another pause, another shift, executive authority level primary. And this time, the silence that followed was not confusion. It was understanding. The couple in 2A froze completely, the man's hand still on his glass, the woman's eyes wide as realization settled in. While across the aisle the man in the navy blazer let out a slow breath, shaking his head, as if witnessing something he would not be able to explain later. Nicole stepped back without realizing it, her posture changing, her certainty gone, replaced by something else entirely, something closer to fear but not of. A person of consequence. Marcus's gaze did not waver as he finished, his voice steady, controlled, leaving no room for doubt. And everything you are seeing right now, he said, is the cost of that decision. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, dense with realization as every word Marcus had spoken settled into place. And then the collapse began, not with noise, not with chaos, but with precision. In the cockpit, the captain's console lit with confirmations, one after another, each outbound flight linked to the same network flag, each system response delayed or locked entirely, and his voice, usually steady, now carried a sharp edge as he spoke into the radio, requesting immediate clarification from headquarters, only to receive a response that was colder than expected. Stand by for executive directive. On the ground, operations had already shifted from confusion to crisis. Screens filled with red indicators as 152 flights across multiple hubs froze in place, departures halted, arrivals delayed, connections broken in real time. And a senior operations manager stood up from his station, headset still on, saying the number out loud as if hearing it might make it less real, but it only made it heavier. Inside the cabin, Nicole's tablet emitted a soft tone, not an error, not a warning, but a notification. And when she looked down, her access credentials had been replaced with a single line. Access suspended pending review. And for the first time since this began, she did not tap the screen again. She did not try to fix it. She simply stared. Emily stepped back slowly, her hand covering her mouth as she processed what she was seeing, what she was part of, the realization settling in that this was no longer a disagreement between staff and passenger. This was accountability unfolding in real time. The couple in 2A shifted abruptly, the man standing halfway before sitting back down again, unsure of what was expected, unsure of what was allowed, while the woman looked toward Marcus with a quiet shock that had replaced every earlier assumption. Across the aisle, the man in the navy blazer leaned back fully now, exhaling as if releasing a tension he had been holding since the moment the first word was spoken. His eyes fixed on Marcus not with curiosity anymore, but with respect. Nicole finally looked up, her voice barely above a whisper as she tried to speak. But the words did not come out the way she intended, because the certainty was gone, replaced by something fragile, something uncertain. I did not know, she said, and the sentence hung there. Incomplete, insufficient. Marcus did not interrupt her, did not raise his voice, did not step closer. He simply stood where he was, his presence steady, his control absolute, because he did not need to escalate. The system had already done that for him. His phone vibrated again. And this time he answered, not loudly, not for the room, but the words carried anyway. Status, he said, and the response on the other end was immediate, efficient. All outbound operations frozen, estimated revenue impact $2.1 billion and rising. And even though the number was spoken quietly, it moved through the cabin like a shockwave, because numbers like that were not abstract. They were consequence made visible. Nicole's shoulders dropped slightly, the weight of what had happened settling fully now, not just an understanding but an impact, because this was no longer about a mistake. It was about a decision with a cost she had never imagined. Marcus ended the call, lowering the phone slowly, his gaze moving once more across the cabin. across the faces that had watched, judged, questioned, and finally understood. And in that moment, there was no anger in his expression, no triumph, just a quiet, controlled finality, as the system beyond them continued to hold, continued to freeze, continuing to make one thing clear without a single raised voice, that what had been dismissed in seconds had just reshaped everything in minutes. The cabin did not erupt, it did not cheer, it did not react the way moments like this are expected to unfold. Instead, it settled into something quieter, something heavier, a kind of stillness that only comes when truth lands without resistance. And Marcus Carter remained standing in the aisle, not elevated, not dramatic, just present, as if the entire moment had simply returned to its rightful balance. Nicole stood a few steps away, her hands no longer moving, her voice no longer searching for authority, because there was nothing left to assert. The system had already spoken in a language far louder than she ever could, and for the first time since the encounter began, she looked not at Marcus, not at her device, but at the space around her, as if seeing it clearly for the first time. Emily exhaled slowly, her posture easing, not out of relief but out of understanding, because she had witnessed the shift from assumption to accountability in a way that would stay with her long after this flight ended, her eyes moving between Marcus and the rest of the cabin, recognizing that silence, when held with certainty, could carry more force than any argument. Across the aisle, the man in the navy blazer gave a small nod, not to Marcus directly but to the moment itself, a quiet acknowledgement that what had just happened was not about power being used, but about power being revealed. The couple in 2A sat still, no longer comfortable, no longer certain, the seat beneath them no longer feeling like a privilege, but like a reminder of how quickly perception can distort reality. In the cockpit, the captain received the final directive, a controlled release protocol, restoring operations step by step, not all at once, because even recovery needed to be deliberate. And on the ground, supervisors began the process of unwinding what had been halted, the numbers still echoing through their minds. 152 flights. $2.1 billion, a scale of impact that would be studied long after this day. Marcus finally took a step back toward his seat, not reclaiming it, not demanding it, simply returning to the place where this began, and when he spoke again, his voice was calm, even, carrying through the cabin with a clarity that no longer needed to prove anything. The problem was never the seat, he said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle. It was the assumption behind it. And the sentence did not accuse. It revealed. Nicole lowered her gaze, not in defeat, but in recognition, because the moment had stripped everything down to its simplest truth, and there was nothing left to defend. Marcus looked once more across the cabin, at the passengers who had watched, at the ones who had spoken, at the ones who had stayed silent, and there was no judgment in his expression, only a quiet resolve, the kind that does not demand change but makes it unavoidable. He adjusted his jacket slightly, a small, almost ordinary movement, and sat back down, the leather seat, settling beneath him as if nothing had ever been out of place. Outside the aircraft, operations resumed, systems recalibrated, flights prepared to move again, but inside that cabin, something else had shifted. Something that would not reset with a system command or a clearance signal, because the lesson had already been delivered, not through volume, not through force, but through consequence. And as the plane finally prepared to depart, the silence that remained was no longer uncomfortable. It was reflective, carrying with it a single understanding that lingered long after the engines would start, that dignity does not announce itself. It reveals itself, and when it does, it changes everything.